I'm Amiella, and I'm going to read something that I wanted to read here for a long time because camp is my home and I love you all so much.
Woo!
So this is a true story. It was published in 1974. It was written by a man named Finn. He found a little girl, about 4 years old, named Anna on the docks of London, and she had kind of been abandoned. So he thought, actually she had run away from home, and she told him she didn't want to go back. So he took her to his mother's house, and they saw bruises and other evidence that she'd been beaten probably for a while, and they didn't take her or make her go back home. And so this is about her time with them, and this starts when Anna is about 5 years old, and she's really excited about language and the idea that you can write down thoughts and then deliver them as messages. So here I go. Anna's major discovery of that summer grew into a very complex activity, for our house suddenly blossomed with little blue notebooks and slips of paper. When she confronted with something new, Anna would accost the nearest passerby and hold out her notebook and pencil with a "Please, write it down big, please." This request to write it down big often produced somewhat startled reactions. Anna's presentation on these occasions was like a stick of dynamite with a very short fuse, and it frightened some people. To be confronted by a red-headed 5-year-old kid, to have a notebook and pencil thrust into your hand, and to be requested to write it down big was for a lot of people unnerving, to say the least. People shied away with that kind of look that replied, "Buzz off, kid, don't bother me." But Anna expected this sort of thing and pressed on regardless. Many and many an evening, I would be sitting on the steps, smoking a cigarette, and watching her ask people to write it down big, enjoying her search for knowledge. One particular evening, after a row of refusals on the part of passers-by, Anna began to sag. I reckoned it was about time to dish out a few words of comfort. I levered myself off the steps and crossed over to the road to her. She pointed to a broken-off stump of an iron railing. "I want someone to write about that, but they don't see it." "Perhaps they're too busy," I suggested. "No, it ain't. They don't see it. They don't know what I mean." This last reply was uttered with a kind of deep and inward sadness. It was a sentence I was to hear more and more. They don't see it. They don't see it. I had read the disappointment on her face, and I knew what to do, or thought I knew. This was the kind of situation I figured I could handle. I picked her up and held her close to me. "Don't be too disappointed, Titch." "I'm not disappointed. Sad." "Never mind," I said. "I'll write it down big for you." She wriggled herself out of my arms and stood on the pavement, her hands fiddling with the notebook and pencil, head bowed and with tears on her cheeks. My mind raced in circles. A number of methods of approach jostled each other. Just as I was about to put it all right again, that passing angel fetched me a crack on the skull. So I remained silent and waited. She stood there in utter dejection. I knew for certain, I told myself, knew for certain that she wanted to run into my arms, knew that she wanted comforting, but she just stood there, wrestling inwardly. At last she looked up and her eyes met mine. It suddenly got cold, and I wanted to hit somebody. I knew this look. I'd seen it before in other people, and it had happened to me more than once. Like some monstrous iceberg appearing out of the fog, the word formed, welling up from deep inside me, haloed with tears, but nonetheless clear to see. Anna was mourning. All the doors of her eyes and heart stood wide open, and that lonely cell of her inmost being stood plain to see. "I don't want you to write nothing." She tried out a smile, but it didn't work too well. and with a sniff she continued, I know what I see, and I know what you see, but some people don't see nothing. And she threw herself into my arms and sobbed. On that evening in a street in East London, I stood with a child in my arms and looked into that lonely cell of humanity. No book learning, no lecture has shown me more than those few moments. Lonely the cell may be, but dark, never. It wasn't dark behind those tear-filled eyes, but a blaze of light. And God made man in his own image, not in shape, not in intelligence, not in eyes or ears, not in hands or feet, but in this total inwardness. In here was the image of God. It isn't the devil in humanity that makes man a lonely creature. It's his God-likeness. It's the fullness of the good that can't get out or find its proper other place that makes for loneliness. Anna's misery was for others. They just couldn't see the beauty of that broken iron stump, the colors, the crystalline shapes. They couldn't see the possibilities there. Anna wanted them to join her in this exciting new world, but they just couldn't imagine themselves to be so small that this jagged fracture could become a world of iron mountains, iron plains, and crystal trees. It was a new world to explore, a world where few people would or could follow her. And this broken-off stump was a whole realm of possibilities to be explored and enjoyed. Mr. God most certainly enjoyed it, but then Mr. God didn't mind at all making himself small. People thought that Mr. God was very big, and that's where they made a big mistake. Obviously, Mr. God could be any size he wanted to be. If he couldn't be little, how could he know what it's like to be a ladybird? Indeed, how could he? So like Alice in Wonderland, Alice ate the cake of imagination and altered her size to fit the occasion. After all, Mr. God didn't have only one point of view, but an infinity of viewing points. And the whole purpose of living was to be like Mr. God. So far as Anna was concerned, being good, being generous, kind, praying, and all that kind of stuff had very little to do with Mr. God. They were, in the jargon of today, merely spin-offs. That sort of thing was just playing it safe, and Anna was going to have none of it. No. Religion was about being like Mr. God. And it was here that things could get a little tough. The instructions weren't to be good and kind and loving, and therefore it followed you'd be more like Mr. God. No. The whole point of being alive was to be like Mr. God. Then you couldn't help but be good and kind and loving, could you?